My name, Fernando Torres-Gil, Acting Dean of the School of Public Affairs at UCLA and Director of the UCLA Center for Policy Research on Aging. And I served on the faculty at USC's Gerontology Center from 1980 through 1991. And completed my dissertation in the late 70s, and I had 15 wonderful years at USC. Go Trojans!
Great beginning. How did you get into the field of aging, Fernando?
My entry into the field of aging was serendipity. A graduate student at Brandeis University at the Haller Graduate School, working on my PhD. Starving student looking for any opportunities to make a few extra dollars. And one of my professors, James Schultz, who is well known in the economics of aging, asked me one day, would you like to go to a conference in Washington, D.C.? We're going to have an evaluation, and we'll pay you to go to Washington, D.C. So, of course, I jumped at the chance. It turned out to be the 1971 White House Conference on Aging. And Jim Schultz had brought together a group of students to work with him on an AOA project to evaluate that conference. I went there, and having been an organizer for the United Farm Workers, I was especially interested in some organizing by some of the minority delegates and some of the minority groups who were protesting the lack of any reference or inclusion to ethnic and minority concerns. And of course, being a good organizer, I immediately deviated from an unbiased, evaluator role. Met these fascinating individuals like Maggie Kuhn and Tish Summers and Jackie Jackson, and the individuals who would later go on to form the Center and Caucus on Black Aged, the National Hispanic Council on Aging, the National Caucus on Asian American Elderly. Anyways, at that 1971 White House Conference on Aging, I met all the leading organizers who created the field of minority aging. That was my first exposure to gerontology, to aging, and it was love at first sight. It quickly became my passion, and I left that conference as an official delegate at the conference from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And that occurred because of someone who I met at the conference who became one of my role models, Arthur Fleming, who was both the chair of the conference and working for President Nixon at that time. And we barged into his office to protest the lack of inclusion of minority issues. And the great diplomat and politician that he was, he quieted down the room that was packed with all these angry protesters and told them, what do you want? And I'll see what I can do. More sessions on minority aging. Fine, you have them. The final report in English and Spanish. Fine, you have it. And then somebody says, and we want more delegates to this conference that represent these ethnic and minority groups. And I remember clearly him saying, I hereby appoint each of you in this room as a delegate to the 1971 White House Conference on Aging. So I was at that conference, my first introduction to gerontology. I was supposed to evaluate it, but instead I became a delegate to that conference. That was my first entree into the field. True stories.
Okay, tell me about your time, tell me how you were appointed the Commissioner on Aging and Assistant Secretary for Health.
My appointment as Assistant Secretary on Aging and Commissioner of the Administration on Aging had its genesis many years before. Having been a White House Fellow, served with Joseph Califano on HEW, I met Donna Shalala, who was an Assistant Secretary in the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Having been Staff Director of the House Select Committee on Aging in the mid-'80s, I got to know many members of Congress, Republicans and Democrats. And having served on several presidential campaigns, Michael Dukakis and Al Gore. And then I volunteered for a little-known governor from Arkansas who I was sure could not possibly win. But out of loyalty, I worked on that campaign as an issues director. Well, long and short of it is, Bill Clinton won his election, my name had surfaced quickly in the White House personnel office from different quarters. And Donna Shalala immediately called me when she was nominated to be Secretary of Health and Human Services to tell me, you have got to be my first appointee in this department. And my response to her was, I promised my wife I will not be going back to Washington, D.C. I've been here 3 times in my career. We just bought a home. We're fixing it up, and I cannot do that for you. But if you could somehow meet this set of demands, I would do it. And so I presented to her a list of requirements that were impossible to meet. Having been in Washington, D.C., I knew what could and could not be done. And her response was, well, Fernando, if I should be able to get all this approved, would you come? Yes, of course. And those included, those requirements, to elevate the position of commissioner to assistant secretary, to give that assistant secretary for aging direct access to the secretary, to allow the assistant secretary to not be constrained by having to report through the HHS bureaucracy, so that that assistant secretary, myself, would have direct access to OMB, to the Hill, to the White House. And I asked for the best office in the building, with the finest view of the Washington Mall, and a parking place next to the secretaries and access to her personal elevator. There are lessons in this for the students, by the way. It's about networking and negotiation. And to my surprise, she called back right after she was confirmed to say, Fernando, I've met with the president and his staff. They've agreed to everything. We met your request. And I had to tell my wife, dear, we're going back to Washington, D.C. That's how it all came about. But it was a wonderful experience. I was her first appointee, the first one to get Senate confirmation, was able to create this new assistant secretary position that had a higher level of visibility, involvement, and I would like to say influence with the secretary and the administration, and put in I put in the first term, the first 4 years, and then returned back to the university world, because as you know, Dr. Snyder, you never want to give up your tenure. That is what gives you a measure of security in an otherwise unpredictable political world. So that's how I became secretary, assistant secretary.
Fernando, tell me what you feel most proud of your accomplishments as the commissioner of the Administration on Aging.
Well, I will be honest with you, Professor Snyder. I was wary of the position, and not certain if it was possible to make any real changes. Having been in government as a White House fellow on the Hill, I knew that the federal bureaucracy is a tough organization to make any quick changes. It takes years to turn that huge ship in any direction. And I also knew that you must have allies, both within an organization, outside. You must have a constituency, you must have friends, and you must be able to negotiate competing agendas. So I knew it would be tough. And the Administration on Aging up to that time did not have a reputation as a player, as a power, as a leading voice on aging policy within any administration. Not since the days of Arthur Fleming had the Administration on Aging been seen as being an important voice. I did not fancy myself being an Arthur Fleming, but I took the job with the full support of the Secretary and the White House. And I feel comfortable and I feel good about several, I think, accomplishments. The first was to create the office of Assistant Secretary, and I've explained how that came about. The second was to convince the Secretary and the White House to hold the 1995 White House Conference on Aging. And if one looks back on the true history, there was great reticence by the White House about that conference. There was strong voices arguing there should be no White House Conference on Aging. Because at that time the President's agenda was very clear. His priority was healthcare reform and welfare reform. and nothing could intrude upon those two priorities. So holding a conference with thousands of senior citizens demanding an expansion of entitlement programs was not on the table. But the long and short of it is, I made a strong case. I could take great credit. I feel I can take credit for having convinced the administration to hold it. It was, in our opinion, humble opinion, a success. Much of it due to Robert Blancato, who we brought on as executive director of that conference. The third, I preserved and expanded the budget of the Administration on Aging. The fourth, I hope and believed I gave a renewed sense of purpose and mission to the staff, the bureaucrats, the civil servants in the Administration on Aging. Another accomplishment I feel very good about, I worked closely with the Treasury Department, OMB, and the White House to get the administration to shift from what do we do for old people to how do we prepare for the aging of the baby boomers. And when I left, the president by then had crafted an agenda to promote savings on behalf of aging baby boomers, to reform the pension and retirement system. So I felt I had some small measure of expanding the dialogue to move from older adults to an aging population and beginning to prepare younger cohorts to be ready for a longer lifespan. So I would list those.
Would you recommend a student study gerontology if they're thinking of a career?
Yeah, I would absolutely recommend a career in gerontology, geriatrics, aging policy, and any of those issues and topics that immerse you in what will be the most exciting trend to hit this country and the world for the next 20, 30, 40 years. And that, of course, is that demographic revolution, which your professor and the USC Gerontology Center are the #1 resource and experts on. There is no more exciting field, no more lucrative occupation or profession, if I can use that word, and in many ways, perhaps no better way to influence society, to be a part of the changes that are affecting this country and the world, than to be involved in aging in any one of its many manifestations. I continue to be involved in aging myself. I direct the research center, but even when I'm involved in other issues, whether it's immigration or aviation or philanthropy, the multidisciplinary nature of gerontology gives one the ability to cut across so many other disciplines, because aging and gerontology forces you, requires you to be comfortable with economics and law and medicine and biology and social services. You can run the full gamut. So it's a wonderful career. I never imagined in 1971 when I got involved, and when my fellow students would tell me you'll never get a job in this field because it's depressing, I never imagined that this field would give me so many opportunities, that would give me such a rewarding and exciting and enthusiastic career in serving not just older persons, but in helping this country and ultimately the world confront the reality that never before in human history have we ever lived so long. I believe, Professor Snyder, that's still correct. Never in human or mankind's history have we ever faced a revolution of longevity as we are now. And certainly gerontology and geriatrics is the heart of addressing this longevity revolution. So I look forward to having more people and more of your students in the field. And as I like to say in a more selfish way, I stay involved with students here. I teach a course on aging policy here. I believe I still have a joint appointment at the USC Andrews Gerontology Center. I hope to teach periodically there, but I do so in part for selfish reasons, because I know that your students, Professor Snyder, will hopefully be taking care of me when I'm an elder and I need the variety of aging-related programs and services that these students will hopefully advocate for. So